Hello, welcome to today's current news. Today is Wednesday, April 17th, 2024. Today we will be listening to NPR. Supreme Court gives skeptical eye to key statute used to prosecute January 6 rioters. And AP, the protein problem. Supreme Court gives skeptical eye to key statute used to prosecute January 6 rioters. The U.S. Supreme Court appeared divided on Tuesday, with conservatives expressing various degrees of skepticism about the statute used to prosecute more than 350 people involved with the January 6 riot at the Capitol. At least partially on the line at Tuesday's argument was the Justice Department's effort to punish some of those it deems the more serious participants in the Capitol riot. Roughly one quarter of those prosecuted so far for their roles in the Capitol invasion have been charged with violating a federal statute enacted after the Enron scandal in 2002, a scandal that involved massive document shredding and fraud. One part of the law makes it a crime to corruptly alter or destroy documents and records relating to an official proceeding. The second part makes it a crime to otherwise obstruct or impede an official proceeding, including a congressional proceeding. Joseph Fisher, a former police officer charged in the riot, is challenging the use of the second provision, asserting that it was never meant, as the government claims, to be a catch-all obstruction law. His lawyer faced a grilling from the court's three liberal justices, Sonia Soto, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson. Kagan suggested that, in her view, Congress wrote the second part of the law to plug gaps in the then-existing obstruction statutes. In short, as she put it was meant to function as a backstop. Jackson said that trying to prevent the electoral count seemed to her like an obstruction of an official proceeding, and Sotomayor said that if this statute doesn't seem to be an exact match for the January 6 attack, that is because there had never been an event like this one before. But Fisher's lawyer, Jeffrey Green, seemed to have a willing audience in the court's 6 conservative members. They aimed their most skeptical questions at Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar and her assertion that the statute was meant to be a broad obstruction provision. Justice Clarence Thomas observed that there had been other violent protests that interfered with official proceedings. Have federal prosecutors applied this provision to other protests in the past, he asked. Prelogar replied that the Justice Department has enforced the law applying it in the past to cases that involved more than document destruction and evidence tampering. Justice Neil Gorsuch asked whether a sit-in that disrupts a trial or access to a federal courthouse qualify. Would a heckler in today's audience qualify for or at the State of the Union address? Those actions would not meet the criteria for corruptly and intentionally violating this law, replied Prelogar. Justice Samuel Alito followed up, posing the question. Let's say that today, while you're arguing, 5 people get up and they shout either keep the January 6 insurrectionists in jail or free the January 6 patriots, and our police officers have to remove them forcibly. Would that be a violation of the statute? No, replied Prelogar, because the government doesn't think this statute picks up such minimal interferences with proceedings. Justice Elena Kagan interjected at this point, asking the Solicitor General what sort of evidence the government typically presents in these January 6 prosecutions. Prelogar replied that the government has to prove that the defendant specifically intended to disrupt the joint meeting of Congress where the electoral votes were to be counted. We have focused on things like preparation for violence, bringing tactical gear or paramilitary equipment to the Capitol, she said. Prelogar added that prosecutors have brought charges against 1,350 defendants in connection with January 6, but because of the need to show intent to prevent the counting of the electoral ballots, only about 350 of those defendants have been charged with obstruction. Addressing the concern voiced by several justices that the penalty for violating this provision carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison, Prelogar said that the average sentence among the individuals charged with this obstruction statute is 26 months imprisonment, and the median has been about 24 months. So she contended there's no reasonable argument to be made with this statutory maximum here is driving anything with respect to sentencing. Still, Chief Justice John Roberts remained doubtful, also probing whether the Justice Department has similarly applied the statute in other cases. Prelogar replied that there is a key difference between statutes that do not require an intent to obstruct and this one, which does have does have that proof of intent requirement. That, however, doesn't seem to allay the concerns of the remaining two conservative justices, Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh noted there are 6 other counts in the indictment of the defendant in this case, including civil disorder and assault. Why aren't those 6 counts good enough, just from the Justice Department's perspective, given that they don't have any hurdles, he asked. Because those counts don't fully reflect the culpability of the petitioner's conduct of January 6, answered Prelogger. Fisher had said in advance of January 6 that he was prepared to storm the Capitol, prepared to use violence. He wanted to intimidate Congress. He said, they can't vote if they can't breathe. And then he went to the Capitol on January 6 with that intent in mind and took action, including assaulting a law enforcement officer. If the court rules in favor of defendant Fisher, a number of the 350 people charged under the obstruction statute will likely have to be resentenced or released from prison. Indeed, some have already been conditionally released, pending the outcome of the case. The obstruction section of the law is also the basis for at least one, and arguably 2 of the charges against Donald Trump in the election obstruction case currently pending against him in Washington, D.C. So if the Supreme Court ultimately rules that both parts of the obstruction law are aimed at document and evidence manipulation, Trump's lawyers would almost certainly seek to have those counts dismissed. Special Counsel Jack Smith has indicated that regardless of how the Supreme Court rules in Tuesday's case, the charges against Trump would survive, because the former president is charged with creating slates of fake electors. Smith has said that ties his conduct more firmly to both parts of the obstruction statute. The protein problem. Raising better beef. No food is harder on the environment than beef. Here's how ranchers and some researchers are trying to make burgers less burdensome. The cattle part as Meredith Ellis edges her small 4-wheeler through the herd, silently counting the cows and their calves. It's the way she starts most days on her 3,000-acre Texas ranch. Ensuring all the cattle are safe, deciding when they should move to another pasture, and checking that the grass is as healthy as her animals. We're looking for the sweet spot where the land and cattle help each other, Ellis says as she rumbles down a narrow dirt road to check on another herd. You want to find that balance. Much of Ellis's work evolved from the ranching her father practiced for decades. Her parents built this ranch, and it's where Ellis was raised, roaming with her brother through the pastures, creeks, and hardwood forests as the family added land and cattle over the years. But now, it's Ellis's turn to make the decisions. She's implemented changes her father couldn't dream of, because for her and other ranchers, their livelihoods and the future of the planet are on the line. For generations, beef has been a way of life in Texas, the most quintessential of American main courses and a premium protein around the world. It's also the single most damaging food for the planet. Beef is the largest agricultural source of greenhouse gases worldwide, and it has bigger carbon footprint than any other type of protein. Beef contributes more greenhouse gas emissions than any other food product. Growing and shipping food to market is responsible for just over a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions generated by human activity. According to a 2018 study by Thomas Nimick and Joseph Poore, nearly a quarter of the emissions come from beef production. Climate scientists say the answer is simple. Eat less beef and raise fewer cattle. But even the wide availability of plant protein and the popularity of initiatives like Meatless Monday, most people around the world are consuming more beef, not less. And as the population grows and more people move into the middle class, demand is only expected to grow. Ellis finds herself at ground zero. Texas has by far the most cattle in the U.S., which is the biggest producer of beef in the world. Here, beef has long been a staple of Americana, from cowboy westerns and cattle drives to barbecue joints and meat judging contests. And it's here that Ellis believes she can make a difference. I don't want to do this if it isn't good for the environment, Ellis said. I want ranching to be a part of the climate solution. Researchers and a growing number of ranchers agree. They believe there are solutions that address climate change and fill demand. For a world in which people can buy, cook, and eat beef with a clear conscience. They point to efforts to change how cattle are raised to retain more carbon in the ground, to develop feed supplements that reduce gas releases, and to make genetic breakthroughs so animals digest their own food without brewing up harmful gases. For Ellis, the solution lies in the practice of regenerative ranching. In theory, it's a holistic way to look at the earth, animals, and water, and how they all interact. In practice, it's an exhausting, never-ending process of moving her cattle to different pastures in an effort to restore the soil. On her ranch, Meredith Ellis runs a line to section off part of a field for her cattle. What I'm looking to do is make a major impact and completely redefine the beef industry, Ellis 41 said. I want to take everyone with me. Beef in the heart of Texas. As early as the 1600s, ranchers raised thousands of cattle here. As they expanded herds and drew more settlers, they built the foundation of what would become 28th U.S. state. Their cattle drives cemented the quintessential Texas image of longhorn steers, rugged cowboys, and awe-inspiring vistas. The state has changed dramatically, but those images remain. The basics of beef. Ellis took over the family ranch north of Dallas in 2013. She's faced all the critical questions surrounding the beef industry. How can ranchers keep up with the inflation? How can producers wrestle back some control in the industry dominated by multinational slaughterhouse companies? Should herds of numbers be reduced amid long-term drought? But no issue has been more important than the beef's contribution to climate change. Cattle belch out serious amounts of greenhouse gases, especially methane, about 220 pounds a year of methane, which is 80 times more harmful than carbon dioxide, and the main greenhouse gas spewed out by cars. The rumen's blood circulates in the largest organ of the cow. In the esophagus, the food passes from the mouth into the rumen. Cattle do it by bathing their swallowed food in about 40 gallons of liquid teeming with microbes. Those little bugs create the energy that feed cattle, but they also ferment the food, brewing up lots of methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide that cows release. Cows are classified as ruminant mammals, which means they regurgitate, chew and rechew the cud until it can be properly digested. Once broken down, another chamber of the stomach, the omasum, filters out everything but water and the finest food particles. Omasum keeps larger particles in the rumen, but allows water to pass easily. The large and small intestine, digestion and nutrient absorption. The omasum, similar to most mammalian stomachs. Once food reaches the final stomach of the cow, the omasum, the digestion system, starts to look very similar to that of other animals, where acids further break down food and allow for the absorption of nutrients. It's the same with all ruminant animals, from wild deer to domesticated goats and sheep. Cattle get more attention because there are so many of them, 90 million in the U.S., and because their size means a lot of gas. Most cattle are fed grain, largely corn, in their final months of life in feedlots. Growing that grain also produces greenhouse gases from diesel burned in farm equipment and the fertilizer sprayed on fields. Overall, beef production creates enough carbon that cutting herd sizes by even 10% to 20% could make a difference, experts agree. They also agree that reducing consumption, particularly in America, is a clear place to start. Americans eating the equivalent of about 3 hamburgers a week, research shows, and if they cut that in half and instead export U.S. beef to other countries, the world would have greater chance of meeting demand without cutting forests and expanding cattle grazing lands. That's because the U.S. beef industry is much more efficient than that of most other countries. Thanks to higher quality feed, better animal genetics, and use of feedlots, the U.S. produces 18% of the world's beef with about 6% of its cattle. Beef is what Texas is. It's not just nostalgia that keeps beef in the forefront of Texas. Texas is home to more cows than any other state. It has about 15% of beef cattle in the nation. For many, it's both big business and the fabric of family life.
What happens when people are sick, or people are hurt, or someone passes away in the family? What do? Across any culture, right? We eat, we share food. Barbecue represents that family atmosphere. It represents people coming together and being able to accomplish or overcome things. Ideas are set around the dinner table.
It's part of our culture, and it's the great Texas hospitality, right? If somebody comes to visit, you feed them. There's a great pride in raising cattle, cooking beef. I know there's some things that we, as a beef industry, desperately need to improve upon.
I would describe myself as a punk rock rancher simply because what we are doing flies so in the face of the corporate orthodoxy. People say cows are bad, right? Well, they're absolutely correct that cattle raised the way that we've been raising them the last 100 years is terrible for the environment. I practice a style of ranching called ultra-high density grazing. Let's just say I move my cows a hell of a lot more than my neighbors do. By moving the cattle the way that I do, we graze virtually all the forage off, and then we have these great long rest periods where the grass grows and it's feeding the soil biology. We view the cattle not simply as protein sources or a commodity to be bought and sold, but an absolutely mandatory part of the ecology.
The cattle graze across the landscape. They invigorate the grasses to produce more biomass. In turn, those grasses sequester carbon into the soil to be locked permanently into the soil. I was at an event at the Noble Research Institute, and a gentleman that worked there, I don't want to be doing this if it's not good for the environment. And so I asked him point blank, I said, is there any way we can measure what my carbon footprint is? The project required an enormous amount of data, but at the end of that, their initial modeling suggests that the way that we operate our ranch sequesters a net 2,500 tons of CO2 annually. The way we do things takes 551 cars off the road every single year. The fact that when I sell my cattle, I don't know where it ends up. And when a person goes to the grocery store and they buy beef, it could be from a person like me that cares an awful lot, or it could be from a person that is a carbon source and doesn't conserve wildlife. And I'd love it if the consumers could have a choice in the matter. What I'm looking to do is to make a major impact and completely redefine the beef industry. We're all the best cooks, of brisket. That's the way of Texas.
Brisket is king in the barbecue restaurants. Beef is what Texas is. It's what made Texas, in my opinion. As far back as I can remember, every get-together we had was at my grandmother's house or my uncle's house. And literally, they're across the street from each other, and our whole family would come. And it was always around fire. It was always around either grilling or smoking or barbecue. So to me, that's how I grew up eating. That's just like what it was.
I did not know how to resolve the tension between my ranching heritage and what the cattle industry has done to the environment. When I learned about the principles underlying regenerative agriculture, suddenly the two were able to find a unity.
as a person that lives outside all day, I see climate change, and it's terrifying. It's far more important to me to do the best I can to preserve this little piece of land that's my responsibility, and do the best I can to help change the beef industry for the better and make just a huge national impact for all of our kids' futures.
Being able to draw and create and show what smoking fire and what barbecue means, and be able to put those into other types of food is the future of barbecue. And with chefs and restaurant owners really getting more involved with the ranchers and with environmentalists to be able to keep doing what they're doing. Food brings people together, and it's really important to be able to share that.
Searching for solutions. For Ellis, regenerative ranching is not only the most efficient but the most environmentally responsible route. Growing up in the tiny community of Roston, Ellis dreamed of moving to a big city far from Texas. After high school, she studied landscape architecture at the University of New Mexico, but little by little, her dreams changed. The more she learned about land use and design, the more she wanted to preserve and improve her family's land. It dawned on me just how very special this land was, she said, and I realized the importance of coming home and continuing for all of us. That thinking eventually led her to the theories of regenerative ranching, which harkened back to the 30 million bison that once thundered through the Plain States. Herds would seemingly annihilate grasslands by eating all the vegetation and pummeling the ground with their hooves. The ground looked trash, but those hooves stimulated the soil, and the animals coated the ground with nitrogen-rich waste. Then the animals left for months or even years, allowing grasses to grow and establish deep, sturdy roots. Regenerative ranchers try to do roughly the same by moving cattle frequently. They're kept in spaces where they can trample the grass and soil and then move on, allowing the land to recover for weeks or months. The goal is to produce more grass that will generate deep roots to take carbon from the air and permanently store it underground. For Ellis, regenerative ranching means moving her family's herd of 320 cows, calves, and heifers, plus several bulls, through 58 fenced pastures. Ellis and her ranch manager further subdivide those pastures using temporary electrified line they can quickly string to confine cattle in even smaller areas. In daily checks, they examine not only the animals but the grass. By building it to be resilient and hardy, Ellis wants not only to store more carbon, but reduce the need for hay or other feed that use up more land. It's a state of symbiosis to where the cattle benefit from the land and the land benefit from the cattle, said Ellis, whose family in years past left cattle for much longer periods on far larger pastures. In most ranches, that's still how it's done. Thousands of ranches are incorporating regenerative practices, but only a small percentage have completely transformed their operations because they don't think it's necessary or aren't able to devote the time, labor, and land to such an effort. Ellis has opened her ranch to researchers from the nonprofit Ecosystem Services Market Consortium for readings from hundreds of sites. So far, their study shows Ellis' work is making a difference. Each year, the ranch is sequestering about 2,500 tons of atmospheric carbon dioxide, equivalent to the annual emissions from about 500 cars. And that number has inched up as Ellis has made more changes at the ranch. Randy Jackson, agronomy professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, cites efforts like Ellis and argues the U.S. needs more cattle grazing, not less. Will managed grazing on perennial grasslands is our best and maybe our only hope for helping to mitigate climate change. Let's get to work. A new group called AgNext, led by Colorado State University, is delving into sustainability issues at small feedlots near campus. AgNext receives funding from the beef industry, and researchers say they hope to work closely with ranchers and other producers to implement solutions.
Methane is
Greenhouse gas, it's more potent than CO2 at trapping heat in the atmosphere. Methane emissions from beef cattle in the U.S., they're roughly about 2% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. How do we mitigate the climate impacts of cattle production? Based on all evidence, people are probably going to continue to eat beef, right? Let's get to work on doing what we can to reduce emissions from all these different components.
AgNext was developed to solve the most wicked challenges in partnership with the supply chain. To think about a new future and a new way that animal agriculture has to persist under different conditions, both climate, political, and emotional.
In the United States, we do have a very efficient beef production system. That's also, we're not perfect, right? And that's why we're doing this research. Hopefully folks feel rest assured that there are people actually working on this to make sure, whether we're talking about beef or any other aspect of the food on your plate, we're trying to make sure that whatever that mix is on your plate, whatever your food choices are, that it's hopefully more sustainable as we keep going into the future. But basically what happens with the green feed machine is an animal will come up. While they're there, the air is being collected up through this tube. And based on that and the airflow rate, we can calculate an emission rate every time the animal visits to the machine.
That's what we're trying to do, is to set up that team to be able to test future tech, not just in its applicability to improving, environmental implications of beef and dairy production systems, but also assisting barriers to adoption. Everything we do has an impact, an environmental impact on the planet. We have all got to reduce that. We've got to reduce it in every form of food production that we have. We've got to reduce it in everything we do as humans on this planet.
Industry-wide change is underway. Even as ranchers like Ellis push ahead with their practices, other efforts are gaining traction to mitigate ranches' effect on climate, with some of the most promising work revolving around genetics. At Scotland's Rural College, animal genetics professor Rainer Rowe has been used breeding based on genetic traits to reduce methane emissions in cattle by 17%. For each generation, with those traits passing on to future offspring and cutting methane emissions by 50% over 10 years, genetic professor Ann Stager at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, also is exploring cattle genetics with help from a $4.7 million federal grant in hopes of determining which breeds produce less greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas emissions are highly correlated with feed intake, so if we can find the cattle that have the lower feed intake, we'll also measure their greenhouse gas emissions and hopefully see that tie, Stager said. New Zealand has been especially aggressive in seeking ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As the government pursues plans to tax farmers for their animals' methane emissions, researchers are studying everything from genetics to vaccines and supplements. And at the University of California, Davis and Colorado State University, research centers on supplements that can be fed to dairy cows and beef cattle on feedlots where most U.S. cattle spend their final 4 to 6 months before slaughter. Feedlots can be ugly, with manure runoff and animals standing on packed dirt with little shade, but they have advantages. Steady feed enables cattle to put on weight more quickly, and the less time a cow lives, the less greenhouse gas is produced. The Colorado State effort, led by a new group called AgNext, hopes to reduce those gases further and delve into the sustainability issues with its testing of cattle supplements at a small feedlot built near its main Fort Collins campus. AgNext is partially funded with money from the beef industry. Researchers say that they have limited federal funds and want to work closely with producers to implement findings. At AgNext, the methane, carbon, and other gases that cattle breathe out are measured in feeders called green bins. Another equipment keeps track of how much they eat and weigh. It's all an effort to take out the guesswork and analyze how cattle respond to the experimental feeds or supplements. AgNext is headed by Kim Stackhouse Lawson, a professor of animal science whose livestock fascination dates to age 6, where she met her first sheep at Northern California Fair. By high school, she was raising a flock of 400. She wants to lead AgNext and the industry to quick, dramatic improvements. It was what was needed, she said, of Agnex, a new way to think about partnering a university with a supply chain, and a new group of people to focus just on innovation to really transform the way we raise animals. On an icy March morning, the innovation starts just after dawn with 21-year-old graduate student Maya Swenson. She oversees one of the first projects at Agnex, and she'll get plenty warm tearing open and lifting 50-pound bags of mineral and supplements, then blending a cattle casserole to be mixed in a truck with tons of grass feed. Alfalfa pellets act as a treat to attract cattle to the green bins and then keep them eating while gas emissions are measured. The cows, back covered in snow, breathing, creating white clouds in the cold air, are important to Swenson, who hopes to bring more sustainable practices to the industry. I want to be on the side of how are we taking what we've learned and give it to the producers so they can improve their operations, she said. The most important thing. Ellis has seen global warming is altering her land. She calls it an existential crisis, the backdrop to the endless to-do list that comes with regenerative ranching. After a long day, she likes to take a moment to remember why she does it. Standing with her 6-year-old son on a cool evening, they watch over a gate of dozens of cows graze amid the lush grass and setting sun. I could stand here all evening, she says. Ellis knows she can make more money selling in a niche market. Others in Texas regenerative ranching circles have taken to social media to promote their cattle to people who don't know the difference between a heifer and a Holstein. It can be lucrative, leading to consulting deals and top-tier prices for cows sold directly to consumers. Ellis could find customers, with one of the nation's largest metro areas only an hour drive away. Plenty of people would pay for beef raised on a ranch like hers, with more than 500 species of plants and animals, and clear streams and shady groves that shelter her cattle from Texas heat. But Ellis has other plans. She's taking a leadership role in a group that wants to see industry-wide change with animal welfare and land sustainability practices, eventually leading to higher prices for ranchers who adapt. She also knows she could make millions selling her land for development into a subdivision of tidy suburban homes. It's already happening a few miles down the road, but she can't bring herself to do it. She keeps figuring that keeping the land as a ranch and doubling down on her efforts represent a multi-million-dollar investment for the future of the planet. That is the most important thing I could possibly do with my life, Ellis said. At the end of the day, no amount of money or anything else could persuade me to do otherwise. Thank you for joining me today.